Hi there, this is Nomiki Konst. You are watching the Nomiki Show on YouTube or Patreon. If you are not subscribing already, make sure to click that subscribe button on YouTube and become a patron at patreon.com/The Nomiki Show, where you can get special access to coverage, interviews like this one we're about to do, and also live events. Like we have one in Los Angeles for Super Tuesday. With the links in the information. Aaron Mate, I don't even have to introduce you because you're an old friend. If anybody's watching our show, they know who you are. You are a contributor to The Nation magazine. How on earth did you get that one? They snuck you in. I'll make the commentary. And you're also the host of Pushback on the Gray Zone, part of the Gray Zone. I don't know, on the Gray Zone. What is it?
It's in, on, it's, yeah. In or on the Gray Zone is
like
totally accurate. Yeah.
So, you've been on the right side of history for the last couple of years. I recall having many debates with you about Russia. I've never been like a Russia person. Let me just say that. But I've never been like in Aaron Mate land. And I got to say, this last week, all hail you. Actually, last several months. But once they pulled the whole Russia is interfering with Bernie Sanders election, I knew I had to call you up so we could just get the truth out there. So Aaron, thank you so much for having the courage to speak out, knowing history, but also being on the right side of history when it's been very difficult to be so. So I appreciate that.
Well, thank you. I really appreciate that.
All right. So if you've been living under a rock, Russia has been a big excuse for everything for the last 5 years. Every failure of the Democratic Party, losing the 2016 election. But we're seeing now that Bernie Sanders is about to clinch the nomination. I will even say he's likely to be the nominee at this point, given electoral math. They're throwing every last bit at him. What could they possibly get him on? They're going to get him on Russia. He's dancing with Putin. That's the line right now. What do you think, Aaron? I don't even know where to begin.
Well, you notice the timing of when this story came out. So the Washington Post comes out with the story that Bernie Sanders received about a month ago, this briefing that Russia hopes to boost his candidacy and help his election. It comes out on the eve of the Nevada caucuses, which Sanders resoundingly won. So the timing there was pretty transparently intended to hurt him. And that is in line with what Russiagate has been all about from the start. You'll notice in this Washington Post article that there's no evidence presented. So they don't claim what the nature of the supposed Russian help looks like. Is Russia going to steal some emails or put out some dumb Facebook memes to help Bernie Sanders? And they don't even say how they know of the supposed Russian preference. It's just supposed to be, we're supposed to take it on faith, which has been how Russiagate has operated from the start. And it's operated from the start for, I think pretty obvious reasons now, that it was a convergence of cynical interests. So you had failed Democratic elites who lost to Trump in 2016. They latched onto this, as you pointed out, as an excuse for their loss and to blame Vladimir Putin instead of themselves for their own failures. And, instead of undergoing the transformation that needed to happen after losing to such an awful candidate as Donald Trump, who presented himself as an anti-establishment candidate. So one obvious lesson to draw from that is that Democrats need to give people an anti-establishment message. But doing that would have threatened the status and prestige of the people who run the Democratic Party. So instead, Russia was a really convenient excuse and deflection point. That converged with the interests of national security state officials who didn't like Donald Trump for their own reasons. Trump was talking about scaling back regime change wars abroad in Libya, Iraq, and Syria that have destroyed foreign countries and that have hurt the working class at home. And, I don't think Trump meant it at all. I think it was a con on his part, but certainly the fact that that had rhetorical appeal and that helped him defeat a interventionist candidate like Hillary Clinton was a threat to elements of the national security state. So there was a convergence of interest there. And that's what they've used against Trump for the last 3+ years. It didn't work to bring him down because the idea of a collusion thing was such a scam, but it did help keep focus on this totally hyperbolic Russian threat. And it helped the Democratic Party establishment avoid becoming a real resistance. Instead of fighting for health care or to save the Iran nuclear deal, we were fighting out to save Jeff Sessions' job. If you remember,
Right.
that was like one of the biggest liberal protests we've seen. And so now Bernie Sanders comes along, and he is forcing the Democratic Party to have the reckoning that it's avoided for the last 3 years, because now he's in the primary and he's winning. He's won the most votes of anybody out of the first two primaries. He's about to sweep Nevada. He's about to have a big day on Super Tuesday if the polls are correct. So what else do they have left but to deploy this familiar Russiagate playbook against him? And I think the good news is that unlike Russiagate was for 3 years, when this idea that a conspiracy with Russia was the explanation for Trump's loss, that was comforting to people. And it helped people, I think, deal with the trauma of Trump's victory. I think now that you have a real actual alternative and a real threat to Trump, unlike Robert Mueller, where all these hopes were misplaced, now I don't think that this thing is working anymore. You can't scare people anymore into not caring about real issues. All the things that occupied us for 3 years about, whether or not there's a P-tape, all that is gone. But people not having health care, people not having, real growth in wages over the last several decades, all those things are here. All those things are remaining, and Bernie Sanders has an answer to them. So I don't think this Russia smearing is going to work this time. I think that's a great thing.
Yeah, I mean, you can see that with how the Culinary Union turned out. We were expecting some shenanigans, whether it's led by Harry Reid or the Culinary Workers Union, the leaders from the unions pushing their workers not to support Bernie. At the end of the day, they turned out for Bernie because of healthcare. Literally, despite getting mailers saying Bernie was threatening to steal their healthcare, they turned out because they believed in Medicare for all. They didn't buy it, and we're really seeing that all over the place. Even centrists are saying, "All right, guys, he's our nominee. We have to fall in line because if we want to be against Trump, not all the centrists, but some are realizing, they're Democrats over Bloomberg, over Trump." Which brings me back to, I think it was maybe a week or so after Donald Trump was elected, maybe not even, and David Axelrod was a senior advisor to Barack Obama. He was formerly a journalist. Very early on, it was almost like before they all got the same memo on Russia, he said, "Okay, guys, even if Vladimir Putin did do these things, or whatever Russia means, because we just label it Russia, the election should have never been so close." Yeah. And I think that's where you and I, in the beginning, where I was like, well, reading Michael Itzikoff's work, who used to be a contributor on my old show, seeing like some of the basic election meddling or the ads being purchased online. Okay, even if it was Putin driven, or maybe some oligarch or some bloggers in the Ukraine, I don't know who they were. I'm not in that rabbit hole. I also don't care. It still should not have made a difference in the election of 2016. And so I think that's what you so adequately explained just now, is that it became a tool to explain their loss. And we've seen Hillary give multiple excuses. It's not just Putin. It's Bernie. It's the Bernie. I mean, there's so many different reasons she's given at this point. I don't see how it can work. But what for like, say, like the centrists, right? The centrists who are thinking, well, I'm really worried about Russia still because I've been watching Rachel Maddow for 4 years straight, and I went down that rabbit hole. I read the Mueller report. I don't know. I mean, they were upset about being fully invested in impeachment. What would you say to them in terms of like, okay, this is real, this is not real. Even if it was real, it doesn't actually mean that Bernie Sanders is working with these people.
Yeah, I mean, look, there's an evidentiary question, which is how much of the intelligence can we actually believe? I've gone through it all. I've written a lot about it. I think that the claims that are made about Russia and, in Mueller's words, the sweeping and systematic interference campaign is massively overblown. But look, let's assume for a second that it's true that Russia actually did steal Democratic Party emails, put them out through WikiLeaks, and did put out some social media ads online. As you say, the notion that this is what decided the 2016 election, I think is strategically is a huge mistake. I think it's a big mistake to make an argument to voters, to swing voters and people who didn't vote, that the reason that Donald Trump won, the reason some of you voted for Donald Trump is because Russia fooled you into doing it with its sophisticated propaganda. I just it's contemptuous of the average voter. And then you look at the actual Hillary Clinton campaign. I mean, look, it wasn't Russian bots or Russian email hackers who kept Hillary Clinton out of Michigan, because like we know now from the internal memos and the book Shattered reported this, that Hillary Clinton's people told her that the more we campaign in Michigan, the worse we'll do, because our economic message is so unpopular. Incidentally, Michigan is a state that Bernie Sanders won during the primary. I think a similar thing in Wisconsin as well. So this is where there's been such utility for the failed democratic elites to push this, because they can blame Russia for their own failures. It's gotten to the point where Hillary Clinton recently, in that same interview where she called Tulsi Gabbard a Russian asset,
right,
she said that Russian social media ads were successful in convincing blacks not to vote in Michigan. So imagine the contempt you must have for African Americans to tell them that these supposed Russian ads on Facebook convinced them not to vote in Michigan. I mean, it's insane. It shows contempt for people, and it's also just completely, by the way, evidence-free if you look at what the actual ads actually were. Even the studies that are used to justify this panic about Russian ads, they acknowledge that most of the ads came after the election, after 2016, and that most of the ads had nothing to do with the election. There are all these stupid ads about, like, there's like Buff Bernie memes, and there's Jesus arm wrestling. There's one ad where there's like a Jesus consoling a young man, and it says, "Are you having problems with masturbation? Reach out to Jesus and we'll beat it together."
What?
That is literally one of the Russian
What does
ads.
that even mean?
Well, the point is there were, if you and what's funny, so you read the official Senate study that was the Senate commissioned a study from a couple of firms, including one firm called Graphica, and how they explain that is they say that the Russians are trying to recruit assets in America by exploiting their vulnerabilities. So in this case, people with a problem with masturbation,
Oh my God,
Russia can reach out to them and exploit their vulnerability, and then recruit them for a future nefarious use. What was actually happening is, it looks like this Russian troll farm, the IRA, was basically a really juvenile clickbait capitalism operation where they made some deceptive ads trying to fool people in a bid to attract subscribers and followers, and then they use their following count to then sell that to other vendors who can reach their audiences. It was basically a classic clickbait operation.
Yeah.
But this gets turned into this supposed sweeping operation that sowed discord against and turned Americans against each other. And in the words of Hillary Clinton, convinced blacks not to vote for her in Michigan. It's ridiculous. And by the way, even Robert Mueller's team has to admit, and they made this in court, that they can't even tie this troll farm to the Russian government. So the way the Mueller report is written, it says that there's a sweeping and systematic Russian operation. Part of it was email hacking. Part of it was a social media campaign. But then in court, because now they're taking this troll farm, they've indicted these troll farm employees. They've had to admit that they have no evidence of any connection between the troll farm and the Russian government. So even assuming for a second that this stuff was effective and was aimed at swinging the election, and it's not even, they can't even prove it was done on behalf of the Kremlin. But the point is, it's not about actually countering propaganda. It's about disseminating propaganda to give failed elites an excuse for losing the election, and also to justify a posture that benefits, a small group of people in Washington who benefit off of tensions with Russia. While meanwhile, I think actually having tensions with Russia is dangerous for everybody, because we're talking about the world's top two nuclear powers. But that's another story.
No, that's interesting though. I think this actually leads to a point that I'm really fascinated with. There is this military industrial complex in Washington, whatever you want to say, like through my own experience being on the DNC Reform Commission and seeing people who represent weapons manufacturers and foreign interests, or seeing who funds Center for American Progress or APAC oriented organizations. There's no it's completely undeniable that there are people who are part of the Democratic establishment and Republican establishment simultaneously who are weaponizing this type of rhetoric to reinforce their own foreign policy agendas. With that being said, I look at someone like Michael Bloomberg. I'm a New Yorker. I ran a campaign, as you know very well, against the real estate class in New York. And within 2 steps, you realize that that real estate class is dependent on foreign oligarch money, not just Russian oligarchs, but Saudi Arabian, Singapore, China. All the oligarchs are moving cash in to New York real estate so quickly as a way to shield their money from being seized by their country's banks. It's almost safer than storing it in Switzerland or in the Cayman Islands because it appreciates. They don't have to pay taxes based on the real estate laws. So they're doing this all over the country, all over the world, excuse me. But in New York, it has exacerbated real estate costs and just created such an enormous disparity when it comes to cost of living, as we both know as New Yorkers. So when I see someone like a Donald Trump, who's very much part of that real estate scam from the late 70s to today, and Michael Bloomberg, who as mayor went on the record saying this is a great idea, this is how we grow our city, it's absolutely ridiculous for them to paint Bernie as this Putin partner who, of course, Putin is very close to some oligarchs in his country and not others, but you know this much better than I do. But like, it's mind blowing to me because they talk about Russia like it's this communist state and they're the ones in the meanwhile doing business with some of the worst offenders, oligarchs. I mean, like, I'm just very curious to see how that kind of plays out in your mind, given all this rhetoric with the establishment.
Well, yeah, and it serves a purpose because there has been talk over the last few years about Russian oligarchs and the supposed threat that they pose to the U.S. But you'll notice that we're not allowed to talk about oligarchs, or at least we only talk about oligarchs insofar as we don't talk about the real oligarchs who really pose a threat to this country. So notice how there's no talk at all. There's very little talk, at least, about Sheldon Adelson and Robert Mercer and all the other oligarchs in this country who control the political system with donations and with the political power that they have just by owning so much, by owning the media and owning key sectors. And instead, there is fear-mongering about, random Russian oligarchs who in reality have very little power, at least in the U.S. They certainly have power in their own country. And the real estate issue, where that is a system that benefits oligarchs, also gets totally swept under the rug and is not something really discussed. And yeah, I mean, what do you like? The idea of targeting Bernie with any of this is just so funny because he's the one trying to, have fair housing for everybody, have fair wages. He stands against everything that oligarchs, whether they're in the U.S. or Russia, stand for. And you see, what they've tried against him is so funny. Of course, now it's Russia, but before that, it was online Bernie bros and their behavior. And they've tried to bring up the fact that he visited the Soviet Union once and that he was against the Contra War in Nicaragua in the 1980s. And that's somehow supposed to be a bad thing, that you're against a terrorist war that destroyed a country for a decade. Because Ronald Reagan didn't like the fact that this small movement was talking about improving the lives of its people after overthrowing a U.S.-backed dictator, Somoza. So, look, the hypocrisy and the absurdity of the smears against Bernie are just ridiculous. And of course, they distract from the real issues and the people who are really in the pocket of oligarchs. And by the way, look, I don't particularly care about Russian oligarchs any more than I do Saudi oligarchs or American oligarchs. But if we were concerned about the role of Russian money in the U.S., you know who has more financial ties to Russian oligarchs than anybody, certainly than I think Donald Trump, are the Clintons. Bill Clinton, back when Hillary Clinton was Secretary of State, Bill gave a speech to a Russian bank, and he was paid $500,000 in Moscow. And afterwards, he even received a phone call from Vladimir Putin. And not long after that, Hillary Clinton, the Secretary of State, she came out against the Magnitsky Act sanctions that she's since reversed herself on and she favors. But
wait, what's the tie there, though? Hang on. The tie there is actually familial. Magnitsky is her brother, or is her daughter's father-in-law. That's the crazy tie. Sorry, on a
Well,
side note.
Magnitsky is named after. It's a long story, but Magnitsky is named after an accountant who died in a Russian prison, and he was the accountant for this guy Bill Browder, who's like a scam artist, billionaire, or close to a billionaire, if not a billionaire, and so he named it after him. But yes, Hillary's son-in-law certainly is involved in shady financial stuff. The point is, though, it's like, we don't. There's been like the outrage about and paranoia about Trump is not just misplaced from like on in terms of the actual evidence, because of course we know now this whole thing about Trump colluding with the Kremlin to win that's collapsed. We don't even talk about that anymore because it's such a joke. But even from the narrative point of view, if we're being concerned about foreign money influencing politics, I think the Clintons are a pretty stark example of that. But of course, all of that gets ignored because the point here is not to confront a real threat. It's to give Democratic elites like the Clintons an excuse and a pass for losing to this awful candidate Trump in 2016.
So, and I apologize. You're right. I completely mixed it up with something else. I was like frantically Googling. It's been so long since I've had to discuss these things. So I apologize on that. See, I can fact check on the record. If I had an editor that could do this right now, they would edit it out. But, so it's
that's why people that's why people should support you on Patreon, Nomiki, because
exactly.
honestly, even a mistake is more factual than 24 hours of MSNBC.
Right.
So that's why it's really great to be doing this.
No, it's people don't realize how often this happens and people edit things out. And anyways, I digress. So I remember I don't know, it must have been a year ago, I talked to Josh Fox, who is a director. He was an Oscar nominated director of the movie Gasland. It was a documentary about the natural gas industry, and it sort of mainstreamed what was happening in the natural gas industry. And he had talked to me about how, we were on the platform committee, and we were trying to ban fracking, a very clear defined fracking ban on the platform, which is meaningless. It's not, legislation. And Hillary Clinton, they pushed back, and of course, the day after the convention, she immediately went to go have a fundraiser in Colorado with the largest natural gas executive. So she reversed her position almost overnight. He was of the belief that the friction between Hillary and Putin really stemmed from a big fight over oil and gas in the Arctic. And I mean, I always find it interesting, whether or not that's the case or it isn't, or where that was stemmed from. I always find it interesting that there are some like factors that are very real, but because it has to do with some sort of turf war, whether it's over real estate in New York, or like, they're dealing, whether it's the real estate developers funding the Democrats in New York and beyond, who are taking the money from the oligarchs, Russian, Saudi, whoever it is, or it has to do with natural gas and a big fight in the Arctic. They don't want to touch these things. And they're very real issues and sort of like the root cause of maybe some of the friction. And that's, he was of the belief that like, that's why they started distracting with everything else. I mean, do you find that some of this stems from just some policy decisions, some policy arguments, whether it's natural gas or other policy decisions that were made when Hillary was Secretary of State that caused these turf battles?
Well, I think it's fair to say that there's definitely strong differences between Vladimir Putin and Hillary Clinton. And if the Russian government intervened in 2016, and by the way, I'm not convinced that they did, at least in the ways that it's been commonly portrayed. It's a whole other discussion, but I don't. Certainly, the experience of the Iraq War, of CIA torture, and on and on and on, leads me to just a fundamental position that we shouldn't accept intelligence claims without evidence. I mean, that's the Glenn Greenwald position that he's articulated so well, and I really agree with it. But putting that aside, there are real differences between Vladimir Putin and Hillary Clinton, but I see them more as, especially surrounding, warfare and NATO. So you have a series of things. You have the U.S. Under Hillary Clinton, when she was serving as Secretary of State, getting Russia to go along. This was when Putin was out of office and Medvedev was the Russian president. but Putin still played a strong role. But basically, the U.S. convinced Russia to not block a UN Security Council resolution authorizing a NATO mandate to intervene in Libya.
Libya, yeah.
At the time, we were told that this was to stop a potential massacre in Benghazi, which, I have to say, at the time I found to be plausible. Although looking back, I think I was among those who got duped, because what the U.S. did was they overhyped what was the supposed threat of a massacre in Benghazi, and whether that was real or not, that's another argument. But regardless, they went much further than just stopping a potential massacre. They overthrew the Libyan government,
right,
with a NATO-led campaign that backed the insurgents there. And Putin especially was livid at that, because he felt as if the U.S. Duped Russia, and the sight of Gaddafi getting sodomized by U.S.-backed forces and Hillary Clinton laughing about it, and then destroying this country and subjecting it to, in the decade since, it's now it once had high levels of literacy and medical care. Now it's destroyed. It's divided into multiple factions. ISIS has a huge stronghold there, and it's created a massive refugee crisis. So there's certainly bitterness toward, and there's slavery. So thank you, Barack Obama and Hillary Clinton, Samantha Power, for that. But so there's certainly bitterness from Putin towards the U.S. towards that. There also is what happened in Ukraine, and that's a whole other story. But basically, the Obama administration, again, with the heavy encouragement of Hillary Clinton, they helped engineer a coup in Ukraine on Russia's borders, and sabotaged peace agreements. And then, this led to the now proxy war that is still going on in Ukraine. And that's a whole, you can debate exactly who started what there. But the point is, the U.S. spent a lot of money and effort to overthrow Yanukovych, who was a corrupt but elected president, and has since set off and done a lot to continue a proxy war, to the point where, when Barack Obama resisted further inflaming that proxy war and sending weapons to Ukraine, everybody, including his own party, was mad at him. And when Donald Trump came into office, he actually reversed that decision and sent lethal aid to Ukraine. And it's just ironic that was at the heart of Trump's impeachment, that he briefly paused that. But anyway, so there is certainly anger towards from Putin towards Clinton for that, and many other things, and also the proxy war in Syria. Clinton and people like John Brennan were instrumental in this disaster of spending billions of dollars on weapons that ultimately went to mostly jihadist insurgents inside Syria, that have created this awful situation where Russia again intervened in 2015. So there are a lot of issues of conflict there. So you can make a strong case for why Putin would have maybe favored Trump in 2016, because Trump was talking about scaling back things like Libya and Syria, and also getting along with Russia. So if, to the extent there is animosity towards Putin and Clinton, I think that's where it mostly is. On top of, by the way, just one more thing. I know I've talked a lot, but
no, this is important.
Also, NATO has continued to expand under everybody, under the Clintons, under Clinton in the 1990s, Bill Clinton. NATO expanded massively, which of course, we talked earlier about the money for the military-industrial complex. Whenever NATO expansion is up for a Senate vote, the arms industry floods the Senate with money on lobbying, which gives you an idea of the interests that are at play here. So that's the backstory that I think is relevant to why Putin has animosity towards Clinton.
And if Putin really did meddle in the election, I'm just entertaining that. I mean, clearly he's sophisticated enough to get to that point. Why would he not think that that Donald Trump would depend on the Republican Party, which functionally exists with this military-industrial complex, both in the two-party system? I mean, that's the big lie of the two-party system in this modern-day era, is that when it comes to post-1990, post-Cold War and beyond, you have a two-party system that is weighed in a military-industrial complex. They're beholden to this, and that's what's so threatening about Bernie Sanders, is that he's literally the only Democrat in the Senate who ever voices opposition to the only Democrat, I should say. Maybe Rand Paul is an exception sometimes to the military-industrial complex, and you have somebody like Barbara Lee, who of course stands up, which is why I think she's going to be the vice presidential pick, just as a side note. But I think that is really when it comes down to it, that's what they're afraid of with Bernie Sanders. Yes, they're scared of Medicare for all. Yes, they're scared of a lot of his other issues. But at the end of the day, this is what makes us a world power, and they're the ones who stated this by making Putin the center of this conversation. I just want to touch on one thing. We can have a whole conversation about this later, but I worked in Libya, and it's complicated, of course, but we don't even touch on the fact that it's such an oil-rich country. And they made a huge tactical error, even if they were going to go with this NATO-backed, weapons facility bombings where there are no boots on the ground, and they were backing some rebels over. It was a completely dysfunctional rebel. It was dysfunctional. They won it because NATO dropped Tomahawk bombs on weapons facilities, and they were able to disempower Gaddafi. But with that being said, you think after Iraq, these are the masters, right? The masters that won us 2016. I'm not surprised why they couldn't learn the lessons of Iraq, and that a country, a state, an actual state, has to defend its borders. And in an oil-rich state like Libya, unlike Egypt, which does not have oil, unlike pretty much everywhere else in North Africa that doesn't have oil, they weren't able to protect their borders, and that's how ISIS was able to swoop in. And so you have situations in Ukraine, not with ISIS, but Ukraine has a very similar situation. These hot spots are economic opportunities, and I think that's what's even more jarring to me is they had this strategy to win this country over. Gaddafi once wanted to take over Africa in his insane ways, but he had a whole strategy to declare war with Chad and take over Africa. But they wanted to take over Libya, to have this oil-rich country, and they couldn't even learn the most recent mistakes from Iraq. And I think the election reveals that their ideas are weak, that they're not as sophisticated as they may believe, but their military strategies and results really prove that in the same way. So I don't know what happens moving forward. What is, I guess my last question, because if there's anybody to ask, it's you. What does a Bernie Sanders foreign policy look like up against someone like a Putin, just so we can tell all the centrists that need to be voting for Bernie Sanders?
Well, just one thing I want to say about Libya is that it's a complicated story, but the way I look at it now is just part of a long effort by the U.S. to get rid of governments that stand in the way of U.S. hegemony. Of U.S. hegemony. That's and that's what I think would happen there. And they always justify it in the name of human rights, but it's never about that. And anytime you have an independent third world government, whatever you want to say about them, they are judged not by their human rights record or whatever they do internally, but whether or not they are useful to U.S. hegemony. That's right. I think Gaddafi was another target to fall because he got in the way. And it's, like Syria and like Iraq, it was another disaster. In terms of what a Bernie Sanders foreign policy looks like towards Putin, well, the way Bernie talks, if I were a centrist who loathes Vladimir Putin and thinks that Russia is our mortal enemy, I'd be very reassured, because he calls Putin a thug, and he talks about how he will stand up to Russia. Now, personally, if I was advising Bernie Sanders, I would be advocating him to take a different course. For example, I would be advocating him to take the reverse of what Donald Trump's actual policy has been, because whatever Trump's intentions were when he talked about having better relations with Russia, in reality, his policies towards Russia have been hawkish and insane. So Trump has basically unleashed a new nuclear arms race with Russia. He has torn up the INF Treaty, which was a vital Cold War accord that eliminated an entire class of nuclear weapons. Trump killed that. He's also talking about killing New START, which was a treaty that Obama very admirably negotiated, and Trump is talking about killing that as well. And Trump has also stayed in Syria to occupy Syrian oil fields and to help continue the proxy war there, really for no reason other than to, I think, weaken Russia and weaken another independent Arab state that is not in the U.S. Orbit. So if I were Bernie Sanders, I'd basically tell him to do the opposite of what Donald Trump has done, and do the opposite of what Hillary Clinton and her class of the Democratic Party have done. Obama himself was a little bit different because, Obama, stood up to intense pressure to arm the proxy war in Ukraine, and I admire that. At the same time, he also expanded NATO. He also signed off on the proxy war in Syria. He also oversaw Libya, although again, it sounds like behind the scenes that wasn't him pushing it. It was people like Hillary Clinton and Ben Rhodes and Samantha Power. So I would, if I were advising Bernie Sanders, and of course I'll never be in a position to do so, I would actually encourage him to cooperate with Russia, because tensions between these two nuclear armed powers they're profitable for a small group of people in Washington, people who make money off of war, but they're dangerous for the entire rest of the world. I mean, the threat of nuclear war is very serious. It doesn't mean that one country is going to attack the other, but it means that in all these areas where we have U.S.-Russia tensions, that increases the threat that something could go haywire. That you could get a false warning, and that could lead to something catastrophic. So I would encourage Bernie Sanders to cooperate with Russia and to re-enter all the treaties that Trump himself has abandoned. But from even the point of view of what centrists claim to be for right now, I think they can be rest assured, because Bernie Sanders is not listening to people like me.
Okay, with that being said, I know I said one more question, but I really found it fascinating when Donald Trump was tweeting about Bernie Sanders colluding with Russia. I can't even imagine the mental gymnastics going on in the Trump administration right now. But where do you see this playing? I mean, is this going to be an issue moving? Is MSNBC just going to be like the anti-Bernie, anti-Trump show? Like, where are we going here?
I can't predict anymore what is going to happen. So many times I felt like Russiagate is dead, and I was like, thank God I don't have to talk about this anymore. So I have no idea where it's going to go. But it is fascinating to watch a elite class and their partisan pundits, what they do in the face of a populace that is finally has a candidate that's actually speaking to their issues, to real issues, and not distractions, and how they handle it, from this fake crisis about Bernie Bros saying mean things on Twitter, or to now Bernie Sanders supposedly being the favorite of Vladimir Putin. It's fascinating to watch, and I just think, as I said before, the one difference from the Mueller era is there's no longer this widespread illusion that this is going to mean anything and go anywhere. I think now people actually want a candidate who cares about issues, not distractions and fantasies about Vladimir Putin conspiring with Donald Trump or now Bernie Sanders.
The way you feel about Russia is how I feel about super delegates. I'm like, God, we're talking about this again. Come on. Because they call me. I'm like, explain. I'm like, oh my God, I'm so sick of this. Please stop it.
Unfortunately, I think you're going to have to be talking about it a whole lot more, especially the better that Bernie Sanders does.
Well, hopefully he'll win and we won't have to. I feel like you're the anti-Rachel Maddow when it comes to Russia, and I'm the Rachel Maddow of super delegates in the DNC.
Nomiki, I wanted to say one more thing, which is about.
Yeah, please do.
I can't remember if I said this, so I'm sorry if I'm being repetitive. But what's like you mentioned about the difference between a Bernie Sanders foreign policy and Trump. In some ways, on the surface, artificially, they get compared and likened to each other. But there's a very big difference. Whatever Trump meant when he talked about scaling back proxy wars and helping the working class, the point is he had no grounds to actually execute it, because he's beholden to billionaires, and he is in the Republican Party, which is run by billionaires, and Trump himself is propped up by Robert Mercer and Sheldon Adelson. Bernie Sanders has a real movement behind him, and people who are not just going to vote for him on election day, but are actually engaged in politics, and that is a massive threat to the establishment of both parties. And that is why, on domestic policy he's a threat, but on foreign policy too, because he can actually enroll people in actually bringing about a humane foreign policy, in scaling back money on military spending. He can do things that Donald Trump, even assuming Trump was sincere, which of course, I don't think he was, but even if he was sincere, that Donald Trump simply could not do, because Donald Trump's constituency is not ultimately working people. It's ultimately the billionaires who fund his campaigns and who he's friends with.
That's right. And you can see that because at the end of the day, what is Donald Trump's average average donation? It's nowhere near that. He doesn't have the number of donations Bernie does. He may have the Republican Party consolidated, but you're right. It's a Republican Party that supported Trump's military budget. And by the way, every single Democrat except for Bernie Sanders in this race supported Donald Trump's budget.
That's right. That's right.
Aaron, go ahead. No, wait, one more thought. Go for it, please.
No. I think
it's the internet. We have all the time.
Well, also Bernie Sanders was the only Democrat who voted against sanctions on Iran and Russia back in 2017 when Trump was killing the Iran nuclear deal. Bernie Sanders was the only one who had the guts to stand up and vote against those sanctions. Now, of course, he said that he would have voted for the sanctions on Russia, but crucially, he voted against the sanctions because they also sanctioned Iran. And Bernie Sanders, unlike everybody else, wanted to actually do something to save this key Obama policy of the Iran nuclear deal, which just shows what distinguishes him from everybody else in the Democratic Party, especially in the upper ranks. I mean, I think Tulsi Gabbard had some admirable positions, but she has very little power, and she gets smeared and attacked for having the positions that she does. So to have someone in Bernie Sanders' position with that level of courage and integrity, I think it's a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. And even if I disagree with Bernie Sanders, for me, he isn't left enough on foreign policy, but it's an unprecedented opportunity to have a candidate with integrity, and more importantly, to have a real movement behind him. So we're in an exciting time, and no amount of stupid Russiagate innuendo, I think, can stop him at this point.
Thanks, Aaron.
Thanks, Nomiki.
Hopefully we can come into studio soon, and we'll have a deeper conversation once Bernie's a nominee in like a week.
It's a plan. It's a plan.
All right. Aaron Mate, thank you very much.
Thanks.